Morning, Dr. Hill.
Good morning, everyone. So, we've got a couple of announcements before we begin. Um, next week is Policy Brief Workshop Week. Um, I encourage you to go ahead and send me an email and schedule a time to meet either this week or next week. Um, if you'd like to schedule more than one meeting, even the following week, because our policy brief isn't due until Thursday, November 5th, I encourage you to schedule at least one meeting with me, but two if you'd like. So go ahead and email me. The time slots are already starting to fill up. So the sooner you email me, the more likely you already get the time slot that you prefer. So we won't have class next week. All we're doing is meeting for policy brief workshops. And my in-laws are going to be in town, so I'll have a babysitter all week. So that's very exciting. You guys won't have to do something, run off and change a diaper, which has happened to multiple of you. So sorry about that. Okay, so the other thing that's happening next week is the conference that you can attend for extra credit. My friend who's running the conference said that a lot of you guys had already registered. Registration is free. So if you register for that conference and attend at least one panel and then just screenshot, I'm not sure if, I don't think you'll be able to screenshot yourself in the panel, but if you just screenshot the PowerPoint, there's a space for you to upload that on SitLearn. I'm sorry, Canvas. We're not on SitLearn anymore. If you click on the assignments and then click on extra credit, there's a conference extra credit. So you can just upload a picture of the screenshot that you take and I'll replace your lowest quiz grade. Where do we go to register for the conference? Ask Stephen. If you go into that extra credit, the link is right there. Also, the email that I sent you guys, was it yesterday? I think it was yesterday. On the weekly schedule, the link to register for the conference is in there. So I got to double check with exactly how they're doing this, but the last virtual conference that I attended, if you registered for it, they sent you an email and you could go to a website and RSVP for which panels you wanted to go to. And then they would give you like an email the day before with the Zoom link for that specific panel. But let me call my friend Barbara today and figure out exactly how they're doing that. But my thought is that's probably how they'll do it. So you just go to the website and RSVP for whatever panel, or maybe if you've registered, you can just go to a website and like click a Zoom link when the panel begins. But I'll email you guys with the program so you can look through the panels and the talks that are happening, the presentations. And as long as you just go to one, I'll give you extra credit for that as long as you get that screenshot for me. Questions about the conference? No questions. Okay, I'll send an email with that link a little bit later today, and also the program and instructions for if there's an RSVP or something like that. So that's happening next week. The other thing I wanted to remind you about, the Career Center emailed me to remind you me that they were doing a CIA recruiting event. So if you guys are interested in that, there's a way to register for it. I think you have to upload your resume. They have a program that they use called Handshake to like schedule meetings and stuff like that. So you would have to register through that, and they will pass your resume along to the CIA and you can meet with a recruiter if you'd like. So I will also include, I'll send you guys an email about that. So definitely take advantage of that because it's pretty rare that the CIA comes to a college campus to recruit. So definitely take advantage of that if you're interested. Stephen, yes, use your Citadel email for the conference. If you don't want to, if you prefer a different email, that's fine. It doesn't matter to me. But my friend Barbara said a lot of you guys had already registered for the conference. She also said you guys were signing up for roundtables, which is not really what we're supposed to be doing. A roundtable means that like you and a group of researchers are creating sort of a space to discuss a research or a policy or something, and that people can attend the roundtable. So for instance, myself and Dr. Navarro created a roundtable about teaching students at a military college. And we had a bunch of people come and we all sort of shared ideas about learning and stuff like that. So you don't want to be signing up for a roundtable. You're just registering for the conference. But like I said, I'll talk to her today, figure out exactly how we're doing RSVPs, and I'll send everybody an email about that with the program and the link to register if you haven't done that yet. Registration is free, by the way. And I'll also send you an email about recruiting for the CAA that comes from the Career Center. Questions about those things? All right, excellent. So we are going to be playing Jeopardy today. And so the next people that play Jeopardy actually won't be playing until the week after next. Because we won't have class next week. So everybody's going to take their quiz this Thursday, okay? So today we have Joseph Ravago. I saw, there you are, and Jacqueline. You two will be playing Jeopardy today. So let me pull that up. And where am I? Here we are. Is chairing meaning let's see, Stephen, is chairing meaning sitting? No, you don't want to be a chair. So you're just registering to go to the conference. If you're chairing a panel, I don't even know why that's still an option, because that just means you're in charge of the entire panel. So you're sort of the moderator. That's what chairing a panel is. Stephen, are you seeing like different options, or where are you getting all these? What's going on over there?
I am seeing different options.
Okay, can you just register to go?
I'm just doing other and saying registering to go to the conference.
Yeah, you're just attending. You're not presenting. If you were presenting, you would have had to have submitted an abstract. Oh man, I think my friend Barbara, who's running it, the two of us are presenting, let's see, next Wednesday or something like that. And we submitted our abstracts a while ago. Okay. All righty. Let's get to the quiz. Okay, can you guys see the quiz? We see
Yes.
that? Okay. All right, Joseph, if you'll pop your mic on, you and Jacqueline, here we go.
True.
Yes, very good. Just make a note of that. All right.
Methadone maintenance.
Very good. The others would be detox, therapeutic community, or outpatient. And just a spoiler, I have not graded your quizzes yet, so don't worry if you don't see that grade up yet. There's nothing wrong, I just haven't gotten around to it.
Yes, true.
Yeah, very good.
Outpatient drug-free programs.
Not that one.
Is it the therapeutic community?
Oh man, you guys both said it at the same time, so you each get a point. Yes, you are correct. Okay.
I recommend programs based on drug courts to reduce recidivism.
Yes, That works. Very good, Jackie. You could also take the answer from the question right before that. Since we know therapeutic community is the most effective, we recommend that for treatment. Okay, Jackie is our winner. She will be back. Questions about this before we start talking about drug offenders? I mean, sex offenders. No questions? Okay, so this lecture is going to be a little bit longer than the lectures we've had over the last couple of weeks, and it is a very heavy topic. So I'm sorry, this is going to be a lot of heavy information very early in the morning. At least you weren't my other class who had to hear all of this stuff at 8 a.m. So there's that. But I just apologize in advance. This is a heavy topic. It can be triggering, so just so you know. But we are talking about sex offenders this week. And the first part of this lecture, we're going to sort of go through some of the stats on sex offenders and dispel some myths that are out there. And then we're going to start going through the different treatments that we have in the US and overseas for these offenders, as well as which ones are the most effective. Okay. So let's just start with an overview. So we have about 6.8 million people that are under correctional supervision in our country. And when I say under correctional supervision, that includes people that are incarcerated, people that are on probation, people that are on parole, electronic monitoring. If you're going through a drug court or a mental health court or veterans treatment court, all of those things are correctional supervision. So we have about 6.8 million of them at any given time in our country. And only about 4.7% of them are sex offenders. So that's sort of the first myth that I'd like to dispel. A lot of people think sex offenders are a lot more common than they actually are. There's less than 5% of them that are under correctional supervision at any given time in our country. So the other thing is that about 60% of them are actually serving their time in the community or are being supervised in the community. So a lot of people think that most sex offenders are in prison. And while a lot of them do go to prison, if you just take a screenshot of our nation, we see about 5% of everybody that's on correctional supervision is a sex offender, and about 60% of that 5% are actually in the community. So let's talk about their recidivism rates. That's the next myth. Most people think that sex offenders are this sort of unstoppable breed of people, when in reality, they recidivate not quite as frequently as most people think that they do. So about 30.9% of them are rearrested for any crime within 1 year. But if we're looking at just committing another sex crime, only 12% are rearrested for a sex crime within a 3-year period. So they don't recidivate as much as the traditional offender, and they are highly unlikely to commit another sex crime. Those that continuously commit sex crimes are an exceedingly rare group of people. So when we're talking about categories of offenders that are least likely to recidivate, the offenders that are the least likely to commit another crime after they've been arrested are murderers. And following right after that are sex offenders. So most people sort of think about it the other way. The types of offenders that are most likely to recidivate are property offenders and drug offenders. Once you start getting in the more serious categories, those are the offenders that are least likely to commit these crimes again. So murderers are the least likely to recidivate, followed by sex offenders. So it's quite possible that the data that we have is underestimating true victimization rates and can sort of distort the nature of sexual offending. Some studies have indicated that researchers and law enforcement officers are only aware of about half of the crimes that sex offenders actually commit. They are deviant, they are devious creatures by nature. So it's quite possible they have a lot more victims than law enforcement and then researchers know about. But based on the information that we have, they do not recidivate at a rate that we see with like property offenders and drug offenders. So those convicted of murder, manslaughter are the least likely to recidivate out of all offenders, followed by sex offenders. That is what the data is telling us.
Professor Hill,
Yes.
my screen is just going haywire every time I join your Zoom meeting.
Uh-oh. What does haywire mean?
It's cutting back and forth and with black screen and your screen.
Uh-oh. Is that happening to anybody else?
It didn't do that when I left, but when I came back, it was doing it.
Do you want to try to leave and come back again?
Yeah, I can try it.
You could try. If not, shoot me an email and I can send you a recording of the class.
Okay, I'll try it one more time.
Okay. All right. So the first myth is there aren't as many as most people think they are. The second myth is that most of them are actually serving time in the community, not in an incarcerated setting. And the third is that they don't recidivate at the rate that most people think that they do. After murder, manslaughter, those convicted of a sex crime are the least likely to commit another crime. So let's continue to talk a little bit more about some of these myths, as well as what the politicians are doing about it. So the next thing, if I ask you to picture a sex offender, most people are going to picture that guy in the panel white van with the rapist glasses that's driving around looking for kids. That is the sort of pervasive cultural stereotype. When you talk about a sex offender, that is instantly what people think about. But the reality is that those types of offenders make up only about 4% of all sex offenders. So when we talk about do sex offenders specialize, what I mean is, are they only committing sex offenses? And usually, if they're only committing sex offenses, is it towards a child? That's what a sex offender specialist is, meaning that they are only committing sex crimes. So when most people think of a sex offender, they are thinking of that stereotype and they're thinking of somebody that specializes. So that logic, that understanding of what most people think of as a sex offender has provided the rationale for the adoption of increasingly restrictive policies designed to monitor, deter, and to punish sex offenders in the US. So these things are like sex offender registry list, right? So if you're a sex offender, you have to register, and we can actually Google that and see how many sex offenders are in the county. You can actually look at a map and click on the dots and see this person's face and what they've been convicted for. And so that's a sex offender registry. There are also policies that are implemented called residency restrictions, which means that if you're a convicted sex offender, you can't live, within 500 feet of a school or a park or a bus stop or a water park or anything like that. Community notification is something like, you have to, when you move into a neighborhood, you have to go around and introduce yourself to the neighbors and tell them that you're a sex offender, or put a sign in your yard that says I'm a sex offender. Some of the policies that are passed, and these differ by state, but some of them also include polygraph testing. So if you're on probation or parole, they'll make you come in like once a month and give you a polygraph to see if you've been around the type of victim that you're not supposed to be around. Or GPS monitoring. So for instance, in California, Jessica's Law was passed several years ago that said that any high-risk sex offender that is being released from prison onto parole has to be on electronic monitoring for life. So that makes sense, right? Those policies make sense if we are applying them to that scary type of sex offender that I just described that's driving around looking for your children, right? Well, the problem is that that is not the typical sex offender. So basically, some sex offenders do fit that stereotype, but it's only about 4% of them. The majority of people that are convicted of a sex crime have committed a litany of other crimes, and it makes more sense to classify them as just an offender first and a sex offender second. So For instance, there was a study in Colorado that looked at all of the people that were coming out on parole, that were coming out of parole and were convicted of a sex crime, right? And what they found was that 20% of those people that were on parole in Colorado for a sex crime could be considered a specialist. If that means that we're looking at so over half of their arrests were for sex crimes. But if we're looking at that sample of sex offenders coming out on parole, only 4% of them had only been convicted only of sex crimes. So the majority of sex offenders have committed a litany of other crimes, and sex offenses just happens to be one or two of them. But it makes most sex offenders are just offenders first and that have also committed a sex crime. They've usually committed property crimes, drug crimes, other violent crimes, but they're not a sex offender specialist, meaning they're only committing sex crimes. So that Colorado study is not saying that these people didn't commit horrible crimes. All it's saying is that there's a gap between that stereotypical nature of sex offenders that those policies promote and are justified by, and the real characteristics of sex offenders that the policies are applied to. So as we saw in the last slide, sex offenders always make up a really small proportion of our correctional population. And if we look at the typical offender, most of them are male, most of them are white. About 60% of them have a previous felony conviction of any type, and only 10 to 15% of them have one previous sex offense conviction. So that's what I'm saying here, that most sex offenders are just an offender first, and it would make more sense to just sort of classify them as a career criminal, not as a sex offender. They've committed other crimes as well. So the average sentence, and this varies widely across the US, and this is usually for your first offense. So the average sentence, if you are convicted of rape and it's your first conviction of this nature, you'll get about 12.5 years. Sexual assault will be about 8.5 years. That's the sentence that you're given. But when we switch to the justice model, we're seeing that although that number right there hasn't changed, the amount of time they actually spend in prison has been increasing because of policies like the justice model. Policies, truth in sentencing, meaning you have to serve like 85% of your sentence before you're released. Those numbers, though, would vary widely if this is like your first or second rape, or you've committed other violent crimes. But in general, if this is your first sex crime or your first offense, you're going to get about 12.5 years if you're convicted of raping someone, and about 8.5 years if you're convicted of sexually assaulting someone. All right. So just to clarify, when I say a sex offender specialist, I mean that you are only committing sex crimes. And that is what these policies that we're talking about, that is what those policies were made to prevent and deter and stuff like that. But unfortunately, the reality is a lot of times they are applied to anybody that's been convicted of a sex crime. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about sex offenders, but we're going to talk specifically about juvenile sex offenders. So the reason that this is important is because if you are looking at the population of juveniles that have been sexually assaulted, half of them were assaulted by another juvenile. So juvenile sex offenders actually make up quite a large proportion of the population of people that are offending our juveniles or victimizing our juveniles in this manner. So if we're comparing juvenile sex offenders to adult sex offenders, they both still have very low recidivism rates. So juvenile sex offenders are one of the if we're looking at just juvenile offenders overall, they are very unlikely to recidivate. But if you're comparing juvenile sex offenders to adult sex offenders, the juveniles will recidivate more than their adult counterparts. But the same thing applies if we're looking at sexual specialists. Very few of juvenile sex offenders are the specialist type. Most of them just commit a bunch of other crimes as well, and sex offenses happens to be one of them. So juveniles' rate of non-sexual recidivism is consistently much higher than that of sexual recidivism. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about an adult or a juvenile. If we're talking about a sex offender, it's very unlikely that they are specialists, meaning they are committing only sex crimes. So let's talk about why the juveniles might have a slightly higher recidivism rate compared to the adults. The first one is that they are smack dab in the middle of the age crime curve. So it doesn't really matter what crime we're talking about. When we compare a juvenile to adult, they're going to have higher recidivism rates because they are right in the middle of the age crime curve. The other thing in this Caldwell 2010 study, this was a meta-analysis that was done on a bunch of studies about juvenile sex offender recidivism rates. And the author argues here that juveniles alter their sexual offending behavior in response to their developmental maturity. So it's clear what they're saying here, that developmental forces play a really large role in adolescent antisocial decision-making and in general, but also specifically when it comes to sexual offending. So the results from this meta-analysis found that developmental issues play a dominant role in adolescent sexual misconduct. So if you sort of model their behavior on a chart, what you will see is that they will have consistently high sexual offending behavior until they hit adulthood, and then you see it drop. So it has a lot to do with the way that their brain is developing, with the hormones that come into play, but also what we see is the same thing with the age crime curve. Regardless of the offenses that you were committing as an adolescent, when you hit adulthood, that's going to drop. So what we know about juveniles that commit sex crimes, they're highly likely to commit this crime again. And we see that those that do have weird sexual behavior as adolescents, the large majority of them will completely stop committing these crimes when they develop into adulthood. The problem here is that a lot of these sex offender registration laws either include juveniles in the way that the laws are worded, or some of them specifically target juveniles. And the point of a sex offender registration law is to keep an eye on these offenders, because we're claiming that they are different than other offenders and that they are more dangerous offenders and that they're likely to continue this behavior. So if you're looking at the statistics that show that juveniles that commit these crimes are highly unlikely to recidivate and even less likely to recidivate after they mature into adulthood, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to put them on a registration list for life. But unfortunately, that's the way these laws read. So at least 33 states specifically require juveniles to be included in sex offender registries. And some states will include language that says that if you are involved in a sex crime with a similar age consenting peer, like a statutory rape charge, some of the states will include language to say if that was what you were convicted of, you don't have to be included in the sex offender registries, but not all states say that. So if you're dealing with a statutory rape case in two consenting individuals, the person who gets convicted is going to be on a sex offender registry for life. So these laws that target adjudicated juvenile sex offenders are based on the assumption that these kids differ in important and lasting ways from other delinquents and teens in general. Again, back to this idea that there is specialization among juvenile sex offenders. But researchers are wary of the effectiveness of these laws because these guys have such a low recidivism rate that statistically it's difficult for researchers to tell what is different between the ones that are lasting and different and the ones that are just going through a weird phase and or their brain isn't fully developed and they come out of the age crime curve and don't commit these crimes again. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be punished for their crimes. What I'm saying is that they shouldn't be on a sex offender registry for life if we know that they are not the type of offender that we need to keep watching. So because their recidivism rate is so low and because so many of them aren't going to commit another crime, the sample size is too low for us to have what we call statistical power. We cannot predict what is different amongst those that are going to continue down this path in a really scary way and those that are just, their brain is still developing and they're likely to not do this again. The problem here also, another problem, is that these policies are super popular with the public. So if you're a politician running for re-election, you don't want your opponent to say that you're not getting tough on sex offenders, right? So it doesn't sound good. Constituents don't like to hear it. And a lot of them don't understand the myths that we went through at the beginning of class. So although these policies are very popular amongst the public, there's debate on whether or not they're actually reducing sexual offending. So if you look at the majority of adult sex offenders that get caught up in the criminal justice system, hardly any of them have a record as a juvenile sex offender. If most of our adults that are caught committing sex crimes had a record as a juvenile offender, then these policies would make sense. But in reality, very few of them, if any of them, have a record as a juvenile offender. So it doesn't make sense to watch these juveniles for life if they are unlikely to wind up becoming these adult sexual predators that the media really hypes up and makes everybody so frightened of. So this raises the question as to whether juvenile sex offenders pose a risk of adult sexual recidivism that is different from other serious delinquent juvenile offenders. So the potential of these sex offender registries that target or include juveniles to reduce sexual violence among adolescents and into adulthood is pretty limited. So what would make more sense instead of putting them on a sex offender registry for life is to use a short-term developmentally sensitive treatment. Since we know they're unlikely to continue this behavior into adulthood, and like I said, we can't just let it go unpunished, they need short-term interventions that with treatments that understand the developmental changes that are going on in their body. So if we can target juvenile sex offenders during their teen years, when they are likely to recidivate again, this can have a greater impact when they are at this high risk period. So treatment can focus on cognitive changes related to brain development, hormonal changes related to the onset of puberty, the role of peer and family relationships, impulse control, as well as responses to stressors such as child abuse. A lot of juveniles that partake in sexual offending have been abused themselves. And so this is something that needs to be addressed in treatment. A lot of times they undergo some sort of horrific child abuse trauma, whether it's sexual, physical, verbal, that leads them down this road into this inappropriate behavior. So we're actually going to watch an excerpt from a PBS documentary about a kid who was abused when he was like 6 or 7. And then as a 15-year-old, he abused his cousin because he didn't know any better. And he has been incarcerated. He's in his mid-30s and he's still incarcerated for the offense that he committed when he was 15. All right, questions about this super happy topic this morning before we move on to the different types of treatments. Okay. All right, so those are some stats about sex offenders, juvenile sex offenders, and also some of the myths that the public just isn't aware of. And so now what we're going to do is talk about the different type of treatments that we have available for sex offenders. So the first category we're going to talk about are behavioral categories. So this type of treatment is sort of like the Pavlov's dog. That's kind of what we're dealing with here. So these programs are based on the theories of behaviorism, and they were molded specifically for sex offenders. And the goal here is the modification of inappropriate sexual preferences. So the therapists that do these treatments are less concerned about why you're doing this behavior. That's not the goal of treatment. The goal of treatment here is not to ferret out why you're committing these crimes. That's more of a psychotherapy type of treatment, which we'll talk about in a little bit. This one is, we don't care why you're doing it. We're just trying to make you stop. So they're just changing, they're concerned here with changing the observed behaviors in which they engage, not why they're doing it. They don't care why you're doing it. They just want to change the behavior. So this treatment has to begin with an assessment. So we have to figure out what sort of inappropriate sexual fantasy that you have. That is the most important part, because that's how we're going to try to get you to stop, because we're basically going to associate that with something negative. So we need to figure out, what is it that you like that is inappropriate, whether you're attracted to violent sex or you're attracted to inappropriately aged partners. Whatever that is, the assessment is a huge part of this treatment. So this is through self-report. So you'll spend a lot of time with a therapist, but a lot of these guys are not very truthful about what they like and what they don't like. So they have to do a deep dive into their criminal history. And they will also do sexual stimulus tests. So they will show you these images and see when you get aroused. So that's the first part, is the assessment of figuring out what sort of inappropriate thing you like. Then there are two techniques that fall into behavioral treatment. We're going to talk about aversion therapy and covert sensitization. So both of these were molded after the old shock treatments, but we can't do that anymore because that's unethical. So the way that we do it now, the most common is aversion therapy. So whatever the assessment showed that you liked, what they will do, a common example is they'll flash that up on a screen, and then they'll put something like ammonia smelling salts under your nose so that you feel nauseated. And they do that over and over and over again until the point where you start to associate that inappropriate thing with feeling nauseous. Or what they might do is show you pictures of the inappropriate thing followed by a picture of a rotting corpse, or just something that makes you uncomfortable. So they're trying to associate whatever that inappropriate thing is with feeling discomfort or feeling nauseous. So they'll use, like I said, gross pictures of like maggots eating things, or ammonia smelling salts, or there's a flower that you can crush up and it smells like a rotting corpse. So they might use something like that.
Dr. Hill,
Yes.
that flower is actually found in Africa.
Oh, okay. Well, what's it called? Do you know?
No, not off the top of my head, but I do know that it is in a desert, like on the west coast of Africa.
Yeah.
Like the Tanzania area.
Right.
And because it is a desert, what they use to pollinate it is actually the smell of rotting flesh to attract flies to pollinate the flowers.
Okay. Well, that flower can be used for sex offender behavioral treatment for aversion therapy. Okay, so that's aversion therapy. Covert sensitization is similar, but it's all in the mind. So basically you are supposed to think about and talk through the inappropriate thing that you like, and then you're supposed to instantly speak about something negative like severe legal consequences, or describe an extremely noxious or nauseating scene. Again, the point here, this behavioral therapy, is you're supposed to start to associate your inappropriate fantasy with something negative. And you do it over and over and over again until it becomes sort of second nature, where whenever you think about that thing, you feel sick. So these aren't nearly as effective as some of the other treatments we're going to talk. That'll be the last thing we talk about, is how effective are these. But that's what behavioral treatment is. If you think of Pavlov's dog, they're modeled after the old shock therapy. That's kind of what we're talking about here.
Dr. Hill,
Yes, Stephen.
so the name of the flower is called the corpse flower.
Oh, okay. Corpse flower. Well, that makes sense. Thank you, Stephen. All right. Questions about behavioral treatment before we make all the men in the room really uncomfortable?
I have a question.
Yes.
So is this aversion therapy and all that actually super common these days? It seems super archaic.
It is. It's still used occasionally. It's sort of like a last ditch effort. But this was a lot more popular in the 70s and the 80s than it is now. Now we focus more on cognitive behavioral treatments, but it all began with these behavioral treatments, and it's still used every now and then, but it's not nearly as common as it used to be. And that's because the research has showed it's not as effective as cognitive behavioral treatments. But we still see it sometimes. All right, let's make all the men uncomfortable. So we also have medical treatments. So this approach focuses on the biological perspective on the causes of sex offending. And basically what we're doing is messing with your hormones. So we can do hormonal manipulation, either through chemical or surgical castration, or we can just lower your testosterone just through drugs. So hormonal manipulation, if you've ever heard of a drug called Depo-Provera, what that does is it gives males the female hormone progesterone, which then lowers their testosterone, which makes it harder for them to physically commit sex crimes. The problem is sometimes you stop growing facial hair, you might grow breasts. So as you might imagine, men are not fond of this treatment, and ethically we can't force them to do this. But some states, I think recently it was Alabama, I believe, said that their sex offenders that were incarcerated, if they agreed to hormonal manipulation, they would let them out of prison early as long as they were consistently taking Depo-Provera. I think like 3 of them agreed to it. Men are highly unlikely to agree to this type of treatment. The type of man that would do this is someone that is like physically cannot stop doing what they're doing, and they are disgusted by their own behavior. But ethically in the US, we cannot force this upon someone. So this hormonal manipulation, which is often referred to as surgical or chemical castration, basically you need to use it in conjunction with psychotherapy as well. It's kind of like a drug addiction, that this hormonal manipulation or chemical castration can reduce the physical urges, but you need to deal with the mental urges as well. And that's why you have to do this with psychotherapy as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about psychotherapy, I think in the next, is it the next slide? 2 slides later. But the reason why you need to use hormonal manipulation in conjunction with psychotherapy is because a lot of sex offenders participate in something that we refer to as self-deception, which is the rationalization that their actions are enjoyable to the victim. So if you manipulate their hormones and reduce their testosterone, but you don't address what's happening in their head, they can continue this behavior just using something else. So using psychotherapy can be helpful in teaching offenders to recognize these thought processes that are inappropriate and to learn to resist their urges. So sex offenders is not by any means my area of expertise, but my good friend Ryan, he does focus on this. Ryan Shields, if you're doing anything with sex offenders for your policy brief, you've probably come across some of his publications. But Ryan Shields deals specifically with sex offenders, and I've gone with him on several prison visits to interview sex offenders, and I have heard them using self-deception. They will say things like the victim was enjoying what they were doing, or the child predators They will see a kid in a skirt and think that the kid is wearing the skirt for them, or a child will say hello to them and they think that the child is flirting with them. So this is exactly why they need to be in psychotherapy, because the hormonal manipulation in and of itself is not going to fix that problem. So we have, like I said, chemical castration. We also have surgical castration, which is exactly what it sounds like. Chemical is a lot more common than surgical. Neither of these are very common. Men just don't want to do this, as you might imagine, as I can tell from the disgusted faces I'm seeing right here. It's very rare that men are going to partake in this, but this is available should you need it. So chemical castration is a lot more common than surgical, and there are various pharmaceuticals that can lower testosterone levels in men, including things like Depo-Provera. Questions about this? You guys want to talk about something besides chemical castration? Yeah, okay. All right, let's talk about cognitive behavioral treatments. So we've heard a lot about cognitive behavioral treatments throughout the different weeks that we've been talking about treatments for offenders. The beauty of cognitive behavioral treatments is that you can mold this treatment for any type of offender. So when we start talking about gang members, we're going to talk about a cognitive behavioral treatment that's specifically for them. We have cognitive behavioral treatments that are used in therapeutic communities for drug offenders. We see cognitive behavioral treatments for sex offenders, like we're about to talk about. We see them for drug offenders. We see them for mentally ill offenders. But you can sort of mold this treatment to fit whatever type of offender you're dealing with. So this treatment is concerned with teaching offenders the mental skills necessary for controlling their own behaviors. And so the first assumption about this treatment when it comes to sex offenders is that they have a choice. So even if it's a very limited choice, if the offenders cannot control themselves, then this treatment is not going to work. So it's based on the cognitive behavioral model, and basically this treatment focuses on teaching the offenders to learn to control their cognitive distortions and the dysfunctional thought processes of a sex offender. So just like we talked about, if you think back to several weeks ago, I think like a month ago or a month and a half ago, when we were talking about the cognitive behavioral treatment that I went to go sit in on, and the offenders were writing out their thought trackers. This is very similar. This is basically the same thing. So this is how they do the relapse prevention approach for sex offenders. So they'll say, think back to the last time you committed a sex crime. Write down the 10 thoughts that you had that led up to that crime, starting with the first thought and the last thought right before that crime happened, right? So just like the thought tracker did with the guy that was going to sell drugs, it's the same thing with sex offenders. So they write down the thoughts. Like, this was the first thought that I had, which led to the second thought, which led to the third thought, right? Say it's 5 or 6 thoughts. Then they're going to say, okay, at which thought did you reach the point of no return, right? Was it thought number 4, where once you hit that thought, like nothing was going to stop you from committing this crime? So it teaches you to monitor that inner dialogue. And when you know the order of the thoughts that happen that lead to a relapse, you can identify which is the first thought, and then they'll say, okay, what behavior or what thought would take you to derail this chain of events with this thought? What about the second thought? What about the third thought? So on and so forth. So once you start to recognize those thought patterns, you know what sort of thoughts or activities you need to partake in to derail the chain of events that's going to lead to a relapse. So the relapse prevention approach then is involving teaching the offender to identify the warning signs of a relapse and the methods necessary to derail the chain of events that is going to lead to sexual offending. So the goal here is to monitor that inner dialogue and sort of keep track and the self-reinforcement skills that you need to be able to stop a relapse before it happens. And this treatment is widely used. We've been seeing it since the 1980s. Like I said, this cognitive behavioral seems to work best for any type of offender. And the beauty of these treatments is that you can mold the treatments or the different lessons that you teach for each type of specific offender. So you can focus on a sex offender by talking about impulse control and stuff like that. When we talk about gang offenders, you can talk about dealing with lessons about like peer pressure and antisocial behaviors and aggression and violence and stuff like that. All right, questions about cognitive behavioral therapy. We all understand the relapse prevention approach? We got it? Okay. Where'd my mouse go? There it is. All right, so psychotherapy. This is a short slide. Again, a lot of these treatments focus, like if you're really interested in these treatments, I suggest some psychology classes. They'll get a lot more into this. I'm just giving you a very, very broad overview of how these treatments are applied to in a correctional field. So specifically for sex offenders, any sort of psychotherapy is based on psychodynamic therapy. And specifically for sex offenders with this one, what they're saying here is that people will ordinarily develop conventional erotic attractions to age appropriate people if they have a normal development, right? So as long as something not, as long as there's not a traumatic or unhealthy life event, people will develop ordinary attractions to age appropriate people. However, if there is some sort of unhealthy life event or some sort of traumatic incident that happens during your development, that is when you sort of go off the rails and you become attracted to like violent sex or to an inappropriately aged partner or something like that. So the point here is to use introspection with your therapist to figure out what went wrong that led you down this inappropriate path. And it's sort of assumed that talking through this problem and understanding why you are the way that you are will sort of facilitate fixing the issue. So this can be offered in an individual setting. So it's just like you with a one-on-one, you with a therapist, or it can be offered in a group therapy setting. So it can be offered in a prison setting. It can be offered in the community as an outpatient or in a civil commitment situation. We're going to talk about civil commitment a little bit later on Thursday. Basically, civil commitment, and it depends on the state that you're in, but states can pass laws that say that if they deem you what's referred to as a sexually violent predator, once you are done serving your prison term, if you are labeled a sexually violent predator, they can, instead of releasing you, send you to another prison where the focus is treatment, and you are there indefinitely until you are cured. It started with in like the 1960s, or actually the 1930s is when it started with mentally ill offenders, like the criminally insane. But during like the 70s and the 90s, they started passing it for sex offenders as well. But a lot of these civil commitments will focus on group psychotherapy every day. All right, questions about psychotherapy? All right, this is the last one we're going to do today. It's been a heavy topic, I understand. So let's talk about what the research says about which treatments work the best. So this study, if anybody's doing cognitive behavioral treatments or sex offender treatments for your policy brief, you've probably run across this study. It's a really famous study in 1995. It was a meta-analysis of the treatment studies or treatments that are available for sex offenders. And they looked at 3 different treatments. They looked at the behavioral treatment, so like the Pavlov's dog stuff, the aversion therapy. Then they compared that to cognitive behavioral therapy, like we just discussed, and also the hormonal therapy. And so what they found was that cognitive behavioral and hormonal therapy worked better than behavioral. So we know that, right? And that's partially why, Joseph, We don't use the behavioral therapy as much anymore. We know since 95, we've known that cognitive behavioral and hormonal treatments work better than behavioral. But then when they're trying to figure out if cognitive behavioral works better than hormonal, they couldn't tell because the sample size of people that had taken hormonal treatments was so low because everybody refused the treatment, right? So when your sample size is really low, we don't have enough statistical power to predict a trend or to predict what's going to work well and what doesn't. So the refusal rate of people not wanting to partake in hormonal treatments meant the sample size was too low. It was like comparing 5,000 people in cognitive behavioral treatment to 5 people with hormonal. It's just, it's too small to compare. So we saw no significant difference between those that went through cognitive behavioral versus hormonal because the sample size was just too small. So either the people would outright refuse hormonal treatments, or they would start doing the treatment and like stop growing facial hair and start growing boobs and be like, okay, I'm not doing this. We're done here. So they would just withdraw from the treatment, and then we have to drop them from the sample. We can't test them because they've only gotten a portion of the treatment. It's not the same. So the refusal rate was so high that the sample size is too low. We can't actually see a difference between the two. So the refusal rate for people going through hormonal treatments is about 60%. And of those 40% that would actually go through it, about half of them would drop out. So we just didn't have enough people. So, however, the study that actually had the lowest recidivism rates and one of the largest treatment effects was a study about castrated participants who didn't receive any other treatment. So it alludes to the possibility that reduction of sexual arousal alone may be effective. But I mean, this is based on like 10 people. So that's not enough for us to generalize to everybody else. So other things that this meta-analysis found was that regardless of the treatment that you're getting, whether it's hormonal, cognitive behavioral, or behavioral, it is always more successful in an outpatient program as opposed to an institutionalized program. So this is nothing new. We already know this, that the treatment that you get outside of an incarcerated setting is always going to be better than the treatment in a prison. So same thing goes for sex offenders. If they're being treated in a community setting, it's going to work better than treatment in an institutionalized setting. So the other thing a meta-analysis will do is take all of the statistics from each of the studies that they're finding and use a complicated algorithm to come up with what we refer to as the average treatment effect. So it'll look at all of the studies across, look at their reductions in recidivism, take into account the strength of the methodology of those studies, and we'll spit out the average treatment effect. And so what this did was cognitive behavioral, hormonal, and behavioral treatments on average, we see that people with any of those treatments recidivate at about 19%. People without treatment would recidivate at about 27%, which means we're seeing if you are treated for a sex offender, if you're treated as a sex offender, we're going to see 8 fewer offenses out of 100. So that's small, but any reduction in recidivism is a good thing, especially when we're talking about sex crimes, because of the lasting effect this can have on the victim and their family and friends. So looking at those numbers, let's talk about why they might be overestimated. And this is why I harp on making you guys read the limitations of studies. Some of the limitations of this study. So first of all, a meta-analysis tells you which studies they are including and which studies they are excluding. In this particular meta-analysis excluded any studies that looked at pathological offenders that they would consider to be psychopaths. So this is anybody with an extensive offending history, organic brain disorders, management problems in prison, denying their offenses when there's clear evidence that they committed them, or withdrawing from treatment, right? So this study only looked at what you might consider to be normal sex offenders. Anybody that they would classify as a psychopath or a pathological offender, those studies were excluded from this particular meta-analysis. So what we're seeing here is the way you would read this result is that if you have a sex offender that is not a psychopath, putting them through treatment leads to 8 fewer offenses out of 100. So these treatments may be less effective with the most pathological of sex offenders. The other issue with this study is how they measured recidivism. So this is why it's always important to read not only the limitations, but the methodology section. You want to know what they're classifying as recidivism. And in this particular study, they're only counting something as recidivism if it was sex offender recidivism. So if these offenders went on to murder everybody, like, so if all of the offenders that went through this treatment murdered someone, but did not commit another sex offense, they're counting that as a success, right? So they're only looking at sex offender recidivism here. So now the way that we read this finding is that non-pathological offenders that go through one of these 3 treatments, on average, we will see 8 fewer out of 100 sex offenses. So we can't say anything about these treatments for reducing any recidivism that isn't a sex offense. And that is why we always read the limitations and we always scan through the methodology. We want to know what the problems with this study were and the way that we read these results. Because this in and of itself, if we're just looking at these findings without understanding that it could be overestimating them or not effective for pathological offenders, or we can't say that this treatment makes any difference for general offenses, only sex offenses. That's important information when it comes to understanding these findings and creating a policy from this. Okay, questions about this? I know this is a very heavy topic for early in the morning, and I apologize about that, but I'm not in charge of scheduling, so sorry. At least this year, I'm not giving this lecture when I have a pre-nob in the classroom. For some reason, every year during pre-nobs, I have to give the lecture about chemical castration, and I terrify all the young children coming to this university. So at least there's that. Questions about this?
I got a question, Professor Hill. So like with the use of chemical castration,
Yes.
does it ever like make offenders like find different ways to get a sexual release?
Oh, yeah. I mean, they can, that's why it has to be used in conjunction with some sort of psychotherapy, because they can definitely do other things and they can still victimize people without the use of their.
Because I saw like a couple of weeks ago that some African country, like all the rapists were gonna get castrated, and I was thinking like that's kind of bad because they'll find a different way to like get a release, aka like killing people.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely depends on your personal preference as to what can do that, you know, what would lead to that release. So it's definitely important that if you're going to do that, you need to also, it's like drug addiction. You can't just do detox without getting to the root of why you're doing this. So you need cognitive behavioral or psychotherapy to understand why you're doing what you're doing and to be able to teach them like relapse prevention and be like, hey, that self-deception thought, like that's fucking psycho. Like you can't be thinking that, that is wrong. Yeah. Other questions?
Dr. Hill.
Yes.
So these traumatic events that can lead to like, you know, sexual misbehavior and whatnot, are they always sexual traumatic events, or can they be like something violent or, you know, something of that nature?
It can be anything, and it may not be. It's possible that you are you know, you might have an organic brain disorder that is like pressing on a part of your brain that makes you like think things that aren't, you know, it's not always the case. It could be biological as opposed to environmental. But a lot of instances, especially when we're talking about juvenile sex offenders, a lot of them have experienced something very traumatic in their childhood that led to this. And the same thing goes with serial killers too. If you look at their experiences as a juvenile, a lot of times they had something traumatic happen to them, but it doesn't necessarily have to be sexual in nature. I mean, it can really be anything traumatic. So for instance, like even a really nasty divorce can lead you down the path towards it.
Okay.
Other questions? All right, so quick reminders, schedule policy brief workshops for me or with me this week, next week, or maybe the beginning of the week after. Next week, we will not have class, and I encourage you to go to at least one panel presentation in this virtual conference. I'll send information about that. There's the CIA recruiting event. You have to contact the Career Center to get involved in that. I'll send an email about that as well. And we're all taking our quiz on Thursday because we can't do Jeopardy because we don't have class next week. We good? All right, I will see you guys on Thursday. We're going to talk more about sex offenders. See you all then.